I have an appetite for background checks. We're going to be doing background checks. We're working with Democrats. We're working with Republicans. We already have very strong background checks.
President Trump also spoke about his conversation with NRA Chief Executive Wayne LaPierre. That was yesterday. The president denied recent reporting that he told LaPierre he would not pursue background checks and later added this.
We have background checks, but there are loopholes in the background checks. And that's what I spoke to the NRA about yesterday. They want to get rid of the loopholes as well as I do. At the same time, I don't want to take away people's Second Amendment rights. I don't want to take away the Constitution having to do with gun ownership. And, you know, we can't let that slope go so easy that we're talking about background checks, then all of a sudden we're talking about let's take everybody's gun away. People need weapons, unfortunately, for protection.
So that word slope, that is an NRA talking point.
No, it's a Trump talking point.
Politico reports that Senate Homeland Security Chairman Republican Ron Johnson is casting major doubt on the prospects of significant gun regulations passing this fall. And we quote, the Wisconsin Republican said that a background checks measure based on the bill written by Senators Pat Toomey and Joe Manchin and a national red flag bill are both unlikely to pass. He was open to GOP Senator Lindsey Graham's bill that would establish a red flag grant program, but said the Senate would need to attach to those grants very strict guidelines in terms of due process. Back with us tonight, two former members of Congress. Donna Edwards, former Democratic member from the great state of Maryland, who is these days a Washington Post columnist, and David Jolly, former Republican member of Congress from the great state of Florida, who has since left the Republican Party. Good evening to you both. Congresswoman, I would like to begin with you. Phil Bump over at the Washington Post did a study of the limits of our concern, the end date of our concern over things like mass shootings. Here it is. Our analysis of the aftermath of recent high-profile mass shootings suggests that interest in addressing the problem tapers out after about 3 weeks, or this week, relative to the massacre in El Paso. As much as it crushes my soul to admit this about the country we've become, that feels about right, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and it feels like what has happened is that there are so many of these mass shootings. Americans have become so accustomed to the Congress and political leaders not really dealing with them at all in a meaningful way that we've almost become numb to them. I mean, it's difficult to say, but we have to recognize that. And after all, look at what the president just did. Talk about slippery slope. He went from one flip-flop to the next flip-flop to the next one. In the span of just a few days, holding an infant who had lost the child's parents and taking a photo opportunity, but now not willing to do something that could have made a difference in that child's life.
All of it as we watched in real time. Congressman, I want to know how moderate Republicans get elected on no action on guns. Yeah, we decided to take a pass on guns. How does Susan Collins get reelected to the Senate from Maine, a confusing state politically, but it looks like there's going to be no output?
I think it goes to Philip Bump's analysis that they waited out, that the attention span of the nation moves on, which is why there's a cry for political leadership, dramatic leadership, not just demand for legislation that incrementally addresses this like we're talking about right now, but political leadership that fundamentally changes the conversation of guns in the country, that political leadership that can say to gun owners, lawful gun owners, we're not going to take your guns. You can still purchase guns, but this culture of guns on demand will change. It may take you 2, 4, 6 weeks to legally purchase a gun in the United States because we're going to have universal background checks, further than what the House wants to do. Even among friends and family, they're going to be checked. Checks are going to be comprehensive, not just criminal prosecutions, but the criminal encounters that don't lead to prosecution, domestic violence calls where a spouse doesn't file charges. Background checks are going to include mental health evaluations. We're going to either ban assault weapons or make them so difficult to get they're functionally obsolete. We're going to ban high-capacity magazines, and we're going to have zero enforcement. As easy as it was to put marijuana offenders in jail, so will it be easy to put gun offenders in jail. And for people who think that's radical, I would point to what Florida did after Parkland. The debate around arming teachers was a controversial one, but here's what they did. They said if we're going to arm educators, they will be required to have 144 hours of training, a psychiatric evaluation, and a drug test. So if Republicans in Florida think that those background checks and requirements are so critical for somebody to carry a weapon around children on a school campus, why not the same requirements to carry a gun around kids at a Walmart in El Paso, or attendees at a garlic festival in California, or a nightclub in Orlando, or a restaurant district in Dayton? We've got to fundamentally crush this culture of guns on demand. That takes urgency of political leadership. Without it, moderate Republicans and those who do nothing will continue to be reelected.
The gentleman from Florida makes a very convincing argument, yet this is what the gentlelady from NBC News writes, our own Shannon Pettypiece. A senior administration official cautioned that the messaging will most likely continue to be messy and confusing as Trump continues to search for a position to settle on. And this is what you were just saying, Congresswoman.
Well,
we've watched it move.
Well, exactly. And what position is there to settle on? I mean, in this country, 9 out of 10 Americans believe that there should be universal background checks. An overwhelming majority believe that we should ban high-capacity magazines. An overwhelming majority believe that we should place limits on assault rifles. And so if the president is searching for a position, he just needs to go to where the American people are. And instead, he's the push-me-pull-you of the National Rifle Association. And I have to tell you, the proposal that was released just today from the Parkland students is really bold, and it's an action plan, and it's also an electoral plan. It's saying, you know what? You're not going to change the law. We're not talking about that anymore. We're going to get rid of you.
And they told us they weren't going to stop, and they haven't. Both of our guests have agreed to stay here. When we come back, did you catch what our president called the leader of a foreign nation today? A new report in the Washington Post reveals anti-Trump Republicans are eyeing a GOP primary race. We'll talk about this in a moment. Robert Costa, Phil Rucker report it this way. The anti-Trump movement inside the Republican Party, long a political wasteland, is feeling a new urgency to mount a credible opposition to Trump before it's too late. Republicans considering bids, as well as those trying to draft other candidates, acknowledge that defeating Trump appears to be nearly impossible, but argue that a recession or an unforeseen change in the political climate could weaken him enough to make a primary challenge more than a never-Trump fantasy. Also tonight, New York Times reporting former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh is expected to announce he's running for president as early as this weekend. Annie Carney and Maggie Haberman write, quote, some Trump advisors are more concerned about a primary challenge than they publicly let on, as Mr. Trump faces more strain in the job than he has in many months. They are also aware that primary challenges can weaken incumbents in a general election. That's what we're going to talk about next. Still with us, Donna Edwards and David Jolly, former members of Congress both. David, to you, is there real utility in that, finding a kind of willing pilot to fly the aircraft wherever it's going to go, but as long as there is a challenge to occupy the incumbent?
I suppose to disrupt Trumpism at every stage is a good thing. I think my former never-Trump colleagues, if you will, are a little more optimistic than I am about what Trumpism has done to the Republican brand, and frankly, the brand of conservatism, which people seemingly are now trying to separate from Republicanism. There was a time where conservative ideology was rooted in a political theory that was defensible. In the era of Trump, even conservatism is suffering from a branding crisis. What used to be ideology around freedom of health care is now turned into ripping away a safety net. A tax plan and conservative ideology that was reduced taxes for everybody has now been celebrating rigging the system towards the wealthy and accelerating the wealth gap. On immigration, what was a law and order platform has turned into a xenophobic one. You can go down the list of where conservative ideology has been corrupted. And so the never-Trumpers that are considering a primary challenge, for me personally, I don't think there's anything left to save. They remain in the fight, but I've made the decision there's nothing left to save.
Okay, so that gets your attention, Donna Edwards. So did this earlier today. You and I were talking in the break. Often when Donald Trump goes after someone of the male persuasion, it's to call them weak. We have all seen what he has called women, his preferred term.
No, Denmark, I looked forward to going, but I thought that the Prime Minister's statement that it was absurd, it was an absurd idea, it was nasty.
Such a nasty woman.
He performed incredibly well today, and for the country, he performed well.
Kamala Harris.
Well, she was probably very nasty.
Nancy Pelosi.
She's incapable of doing deals. She's a nasty, vindictive, horrible person.
So we get the talking point, Donna Edwards.
Well, I mean, the President of the United States has really decided that if a woman challenges him in any way, shape, or form, then he describes her as nasty. And so Prime Minister Friedrichsen can put herself on the list of really strong, powerful women who dared to challenge Donald Trump. And this is it's another reason, frankly, why he's losing suburban women, why he's losing college-educated women, and now high school educated women, because non-college, because the president has a way of talking about women that is, frankly, just offensive.
David Jolly, it is a good question because at the end of the day, this comes down to the business of politics. How do you do Hispanic outreach now if you're the Trump campaign? How do you do Jewish outreach after what we've heard this week?
Donald Trump's done something very different. He's moved out of politics into this cultural conversation. And at times, Donna and I were talking earlier, as you try to provide political analysis, some moments are not political, they're cultural. And for me, the one example I draw that I would suggest makes it hard for the president to do outreach into certain communities is my wife and I, as we've talked, have a 5-month-old baby at home. My hope in this moment has nothing to do with politics, but it's that this man is out of the Oval Office before my daughter's old enough to recognize what the presidency is, that my daughter's not exposed to this type of leadership. And so I think, regardless of the community you're in, if you're those swing women voters in suburban districts across the country, if you're communities of color that he continues to attack, if you're Jewish Americans, if you're Catholic Americans, if you're Muslim Americans that he continues to disparage, you want this man gone so that the lessons you teach your children are that we are better as a culture than what this president espouses.
On that quote and on that note, our thanks to two of our frequent guests, David Jolly and Donna Edwards. Thank you both for coming by tonight. And coming up,